Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Betty Sutton. I'm the administrator of the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, the commander of the U.S. Coast Guard 9th District, Rear Admiral June E. Ryan. Today marks the City Club's 4th annual State of the Great Lakes Address. This annual forum began in 2012 as an effort by the City Club to focus our collective attention on our magnificent Great Lakes, arguably the most important natural resource of our region, containing 1/5 of the world's fresh water, some 6 quadrillion gallons that reach our shore less than a mile from where I stand right now. Now, last year I had the honor of delivering this address. Today that honor belongs to Rear Admiral Ryan, the first woman to command the 9th District of the U.S. Coast Guard. She assumed her duties in June of 2015 and is responsible for all Coast Guard activities on the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, an area that encompasses 8 states, a 1,500-mile international border, a workforce of more than 6,000 Coast Guard active duty, reserve, civilian, and auxiliary men and women. The U.S. Coast Guard is the only military organization within the Department of Homeland Security that is charged with protecting not only the marine transportation system and infrastructure, but also our natural and economic resources and the territorial integrity of our nation from both internal and external threats, natural and man-made. They protect these interests in U.S. ports, inland waterways, along the coasts, and on international waters. Within the 9th Coast Guard District, primary responsibilities include delivering multi-mission services in search and rescue, maritime safety and security, environmental protection, maritime law enforcement, aids to navigation, and icebreaking. As stewards of the Great Lakes, we want to protect our most precious resource, and there are challenges to overcome. From eliminating the scourge of destructive and toxic algal blooms to preventing the introduction of harmful invasive species into the Great Lakes system. Given these and other challenges we face in protecting our precious waters, what does the future of the Great Lakes look like to stewards of the lakes? It's in this context that Rear Admiral Ryan joins us today. June E. Ryan enlisted in the Coast Guard Reserves in 1982 and worked her way up to the position of Rear Admiral. She attained the rank of Bosun Mate's 3rd class before graduating from Officer Candidate School in 1985. Rear Admiral Ryan's staff tours include assignments as the senior instructor of the Maritime Law Enforcement School, 4 tours in the Coast Guard headquarters, 2 tours in the Coast Guard Pacific area, including Pacific Area Chief of Staff. She also served as a military aide to the President, the 3rd woman in U.S. history to do so. Rear Admiral Ryan is an exceptional leader for the Coast Guard's 9th District and for our community. She is highly regarded not only throughout the maritime community, but far beyond. It's been my distinct honor to work with Commander Ryan of the 9th District, and it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce her to you today. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please welcome Rear Admiral June E. Ryan.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon to the City Club. Thank you so much, Betty, for that wonderful introduction. She and I just met each other a year ago, but I think we're somewhere past sisters, I think, in a different life. So What a tremendous honor to have you introduce me today. And thank you also for the audience who took some time out today to learn a little bit more about the Great Lakes and the challenges that we have, but also the opportunities that we have, as well as those that I believe are listening by radio and other media. So on behalf of Cleveland's hometown military organization, it's a very special honor to be here. I am pleased to follow Betty Sutton, as she said last year, in this fourth state of the Great Lakes. So as this annual forum is titled State of the Great Lakes, if I had to characterize the state of the Great Lakes, I would say it is strong and vibrant. I base this on my vantage point as a 9th District Commander as I lead the men and women who choose to serve their country in this very unique and special way. But these leaders of the lakes will be the first to tell you that they do not do it alone. We cannot do it alone. We cannot keep these Great Lakes great without the help of many of you in this room, without the help of our federal, tribal, state, provincial, and local agency partners. We cannot keep the Great Lakes great without the maritime industry, the nonprofit organizations, and the greater maritime communities, and of course the citizens of not one, but 2 countries. If I looked at the Great Lakes, or you looked at the Great Lakes from space, you would see it more of a beehive of activity. All of us, each of us, have a special part in protecting and sustaining this binational treasure. Some of you, or maybe even many of you, have heard the 70-80-90 rule. 70% of the world's surface is covered by water. 80% of the world's population lives near that water. And an incredible 90% of commodities that you and I have in our homes ply the global supply chain on the ocean's waters and on the globe. We rely on these interconnected rivers, lakes, and coastal waterways to move cargo that feeds us, to move cargo that supplies us with energy, and to move cargo that connects us with this global supply chain that drives our economy. We use these same waters to recreate on, and in our region here, we use these lakes as a source of drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people. These lakes mean many different things to many different and diverse users. And in full recognition of the importance and value of our system of this interconnected waterway and these maritime interests, the Coast Guard is charged with ensuring the maritime safety, security, and stewardship of our nation's waters. And I'm proud to be the 9th District Commander and lead the dedicated active duty, reserve, civil servant, and auxiliary members that work very hard on that safety, security, and stewardship of our Great Lakes. The Coast Guard's ability to conduct distinct and interrelated maritime functions, coupled with its broad authorities, give the service this multi-mission character. Its strength is boundless to our nation. We are first, as many of you know, we're first responders. We're like the ambulance on the water, as my daughter would tell you. We're the regulators. We're the enforcers of our laws and treaties. We are the protectors of our natural resources. We are facilitators of transportation and trade. We conduct humanitarian missions and operations both here and abroad, and we are at all times one of the 5 armed services. One of the more recognizable and rewarding safety missions that you see is, of course, our search and rescue. The search and rescue, most recognizable that you see is a lot of times our small boats and helicopters that are on the waters. The helicopters, of course, come from Air Station Detroit and Traverse City. We have over 187 boats and 47 small boat stations. But behind every small boat and behind every helicopter that's launched are dozens of folks behind the scenes. They stand the watch 7/24 in our command centers, at our vessel traffic centers, at our sectors, and at our districts. So let me just give you one example. We worked a search and rescue case where there was a missing 71-year-old man. We found his boat. Unfortunately, he was not in the boat. He obviously had fallen overboard. So we relied on the local dive teams to bring in their side scan sonar to try and provide resolution to the family. And unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. And that happens a lot in many of our cases. But I will tell you, after we had to suspend that case, I got a call from the family. And the family said, you know, Petty Officer, and I'll call her first name, Emily, She said, talking to Emily, who was in our command center, was like getting a hug over the phone every time she called us. And you know, that's just something you can't teach at any school. But that really speaks to the quality of people that serve your Coast Guard, that are your guardians of the Great Lakes every day. 7 by 24. These guardians saved 587 lives last year, assisted over 7,000 people, and saved more than $12 million in property. Our search and rescue efforts have been really efficient and have benefited from many recent advances that some of you may know about. For example, Rescue 21. We now have a direction finder on a lot of our towers. So, for example, if the table over here were to have a rescue call for us, right? A lot of times we have towers that are around the perimeter of the room. And your Mayday call might hit off of this tower and might hit off of a tower where I am. And where those two lines of position cross, we now know where you are. And that really takes the search out of search and rescue. And that's just one of the technologies. We also have new boats that go over 45 knots along with our helicopters. Some of the global positioning systems that we have, electronic charts, have all really come together to make boating safety and a part of that maritime safety so effective. So effective, 63% reduction. 63% reduction in search and rescue just over the last decade on the Great Lakes, which is really a great testimony. Obviously, our recreational vessels are not the only vessels on the water. Another significant part of our maritime safety and our value to the nation is the Commercial Vessel Safety Program. Every year, our marine inspectors and our vessel examiners conduct hundreds of vessel inspections to ensure the cargo ships, passenger vessels, and all the other commercial ships are operating within the laws and regulations that govern the navigation, the fire prevention, the life-saving equipment, and engineering and stability. So to put it more plainly, we are there before you are there. So if you go on a dinner cruise, we were there before you were there. If you go on one of the Mackinac ferries, one of our inspectors was there before you were there. They also ensure that the crews operating these boats are licensed and properly documented. This is also true of a lot of the vessels that you see that don't take passengers for hire, specifically our Lakers. And I will state here publicly, and I have in many other forums, that the masters and operators, in my opinion, on the Great Lakes are the best in the world. Many of them have grown up on the Great Lakes, and they have been plying these waters for over 50 years, these waters on the Great Lakes. So when somebody talks to me about what is your thought, what is your epitome of the professional mariner, I can tell you, I think nothing more than of the masters that I've had the opportunity to sail with on the Great Lakes. They are really incredible individuals. So in addition to ensuring this vessel's crew, the regulation and inspection activities, I have heard great reports from our field inspectors that the maritime industry is on the same page with us. And what do I mean by that? Safety and security is not just a Coast Guard thing anymore. It is good for business. It is good for the economy. And many times they are innovative and thinking of new ways, and we're thinking of new ideas together that makes the maritime environment that much better. Prevention is just one of the three underpinnings of our operations here on the lakes. However, you know, accidents happen, and if we're unable to prevent that accident, we want to be prepared. So we have an entire suite of contingency plans that we have in place. What happens if? And we exercise those what happens if plans on a fairly regular basis. And then we also want to train and be ready to respond. Our motto in the Coast Guard, Semper Paratus, always ready, and we always strive to be that. Going hand in hand with maritime safety is maritime security. An essential attribute of any nation is its ability to protect its citizens. So here on the North Coast, as Miss Betty Sutton labeled it last year, we have, as she mentioned, 1,500 miles of maritime border and 6,700 miles of shoreline. In many places, the navigable waters of the river cross the border. So although the river may be going straight, the navigable waterways or the deep part of that channel might be serpentine back and forth. So a vessel coming in the Seaway and plying the waters on the Great Lakes may cross the international border 27 different times. So, in fact, a few of our Coast Guard stations, the one up in Belle Isle, for example, when they get underway, the first thing they have to do is cross into Canadian waters just to go on patrol. And it happens a lot. So the Great Lakes are really about international waters of 2 sovereign nations, combined with over 40 tribal interests. We have 40 tribal interests on the Great Lakes, 8 states, 3 Canadian provinces, and hundreds of counties and local stakeholders and law enforcement jurisdictions. So needless to say, those in law enforcement will recognize that this is a pretty challenging and complex area to operate. But we remain vigilant as we work closely with our Canadian, federal, tribal, state, and local law enforcement officials and intelligence. We seek first to prevent a security incident or a terrorist incident, and at all times to be always ready. As we prepare to respond to any consequence, whether that's man-made or a natural disaster, the maritime sector comes together with us. Our field commanders are head of the Federal Maritime Security Coordinators. They are designated as the coordinators, and they head up the Federal Maritime Area Committees. Those area committees are responsible for preventing the security incident from ever happening. In our law enforcement program, as I mentioned already, we crossed the international border several times. So we employed the Shipwriter program across the Great Lakes. Shipwriter is really where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, who is their law enforcement arm, and the Coast Guard match up. Now what we don't do is we don't have 2 different boats out on the water. One of the RCMP folks will ride our boats, or we will ride an RCMP boat, and we go out on the same boat, on the same patrol. What does that mean? If we have a boat that tries to cross the water and flee and use that boundary, that international boundary, to hide behind, it doesn't matter where they go, because now we have both countries on one boat. If that boat is in U.S. waters and tries to flee to Canada, the RCMP agent on board takes control and enforces all of their laws that are applicable to that particular incident or that particular vessel. If it's on the Canadian side and they try to go over and flee into the U.S. side, the U.S. Coast Guard will take and apply all of our applicable laws. And so it really has become this seamless security strength within our 2 nations. And it can no longer be exploited. Another U.S. security component is the joint initial verification exams that we conduct with Transport Canada, another agency in Canada. So as the saltwater vessels come into the Seaway, we want to make sure that those vessels have the security mechanisms to be able to know who's on their boat, access control, and monitoring. We also have those same levels of regimes here in the U.S. So every vessel has to have a security regime, and every facility on the water has to have a security regime. They have to know who's coming in and coming off of their facility, and vessels have to know who's coming in and off of theirs. Now, I really can't talk about maritime security in Cleveland without the big elephant in the room. In 5 weeks, we're going to see the Republican National Convention here. And so what we really wanted to describe here is we are obviously in partner with all of our federal, local agencies, and you'll really see this come together. Our sector in Buffalo has been working over 8 months with all of the other agencies, of course Secret Service being in the lead as the national security event unfolds. And so we will meet with all of those folks. Our part, of course, will be the maritime security on the water. So what will that mean? I would say if you take nothing else home today, other than a full belly from lunch, the waterways in Cleveland are open. The waterways in Cleveland are open. We will, to the greatest extent possible, keep the waterways of Cleveland open. We have manufacturers up the Cuyahoga River that need that raw material. We have folks who want to recreate on the water. Maybe folks are visiting and they want to recreate on the water. So we will do that to the extent. What does that mean? We may have to temporarily close a waterway or a water access when a VIP or somebody whose Secret Service has what I would call the bubble, right? So as the bubble travels around Cleveland, you're going to see, roads stopped perhaps during that time that they transit. If that bubble happens to touch the waterway, we will temporarily suspend those operations or close that waterway until the bubble departs, and then the waterways will be back open. So I just really wanted to let you know what our role is. We're not doing it alone. We're not doing it alone here in Cleveland, and we are bringing in our deployable specialized forces that have some specialized equipment and specialized tactics, techniques, and procedures, as well as dogs and other things that you don't normally see. So we are full up round as it relates to the Republican National Convention. So in addition to our security and safety regime, we also really embrace our stewardship responsibilities. Some of the key facts of the Great Lakes: our system is shared, it is seasonal, and it is sensitive. And we embrace that stewardship responsibility with great vigor. So when us, along with many of our counterparts, one of the first things we do is we mark all of the channels that we talked about. We mark that serpentine river with all of the buoy systems. In cold weather, we actually pull over 1,200 buoys every single year and put 1,200 buoys back every single spring. And then we put some hardened buoys for the ice season. When the winter season really sets in upon us, of course, we, along with our Canadian counterparts, deploy the icebreakers that keep the critical waterways open, that move over $2 billion of commerce during that winter. I was fortunate enough to have command of the Coast Guard cutter Neah Bay that's home ported here in Cleveland. And so when I got the opportunity to come back as the district commander, it was awesome to be able to come back home. One of the greatest legends in both buoy tending and in icebreaking, I have to tell you, is here today, and it's Captain John Little. He's my chief of staff, who will retire after 29 years of service to his nation, and over 10 of it has been here in District 9, and it's been a great... So he has also been the CEO of the Mighty Mackinac, and we talked about the Lakers, and those of us who have been in the symposium today have talked about the Lakers. And when those folks who have been plying these waters for many, many years take heed and take note of a person and pick up the phone and thank them, that you know that he is a very special person. So thank you so much. So facilitating that commerce, of course, is very important. We talked a little bit at the symposium about the 1,000 footers and how much they can carry, over 70,000 pounds of 70,000 tons of iron ore, the equivalent of 7 trains with 100 rail cars and 3,000 semi-trucks. So what I thought I would do is do a little math. So 3,000 semi-trucks. Some people say 2,800, 3,000. We'll call it, okay? Each semi-truck, according to Wikipedia, is about 70 feet long. So 70 times 3,000 is about 210,000 feet, which divided in a mile, 5,280, right, gives you about somewhere between 39 and 40 mile convoy that one ship carries. So that's a truck from here, from the Cleveland Club, all the way to Vermilion with no space in between. One truck. So I'm very thankful for the 1,000 footers that ply our waters, because when we leave here, we're actually going to be able to get home without having a 37 mile backup on I-90. So they are 25 times more fuel efficient than a truck, and 25% more fuel efficient than rail. So that's just a small part of what your marine industry are doing for you on the Great Lakes and for our environment. As I previously mentioned, we also help sustain our Great Lakes through our federal on-scene coordinator role, which is our oil spill role. And most recently, I have asked our commanders to really pay attention to some of the pipelines that might, some of the pipeline cases that folks have, and our oil spill response plans that we have been putting into place, and those exercises I have asked to make sure that they focus on that possibility. And we've been exercising those fairly regularly. We had just 2 this year, in fact, one up in the Straits and one right outside of Detroit. As we talked about, nothing we do on the Great Lakes is not without Canada. Some of you may have heard about the tank barge Argo. So the tank barge Argo sank in 1937. In 2013, it was listed as one of the greatest ship hazards, potential hazards on the Great Lakes. And if it were ever found, because of the chemicals that it had on board and the petroleum it had on board, it could be a huge economic disaster. So we actually created a plan that, if we ever find the Argo, we are going to exercise this plan. We exercised it with Canada because we were 99% confident that Argo was in Canadian waters. An organization called CLUE, the Cleveland Underwater Explorers, found it, and it was in U.S. waters. Rats. Now, I will say the good news is we have a really, in our nation, post-Exxon Valdez, have a really great regime called the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund from OPA 90. And so we were able to take complete control. Of course, there's no responsible party at that point, so we federalized the finding of the Argo, and we were able to clean that up. So that was with the Coast Guard, obviously, Ohio EPA, 11 other federal, state, and local agencies, and Canada all teamed up. Canada was also providing us with all of the plume modeling and things like that as it ventured back and forth. Thankfully, we did not have other than just a little bit of residual spill, but we were able, with the $5.2 million provided from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund and $450,000 from the Hazard Material Superfund, like a Superfund site. So chemicals and oil get funded differently. We were able to hot tap the tanks, and in 5 days we took off a total of 33,475 of an oil water mix, hazardous mix, off of the tank barge Argo in Western Lake Erie, right off of Kelly's Island. So that was a really great success. So when I say that the Great Lakes are strong and vibrant, I can tell you that the Great Lakes are strong and vibrant because there's 33,000 gallons worth of chemicals that are no longer in Lake Erie that were there last year. We're also teaming up to keep other things out of the lakes. Fish. Asian carp. We don't have the lead for Asian carp. As you know, the Army Corps of Engineers is working on that problem set, and they have barriers and other things. Our role in that is to really look at when they put one of these mechanisms into place, whether that may be mechanical, chemical, water cannons, whatever ideas they may have on trying to keep the Asian carp out. How does that affect the boating public? How is that going to affect the maritime commerce and our ability to connect to that global supply chain that we say is so important to drive our economy? So we've been really working on that problem set hand in glove with them for decades. So that's a supporting role. We do have a lead role in our ballast water and ballast water regimes, and we have been given the statutory authority through 2 acts of Congress. The Coast Guard has been promulgated regulations designed to prevent the introduction and the spread of aquatic nuisance species in the waters of the United States through ballast water exchange. And so we've been working on that. Betty Sutton last year talked about since 2006 there has not been a new aquatic nuisance species introduced into the Great Lakes via ballast water, and I can tell you that this year that record continues. A lot of that is because of the regime that we have in place. So as a laker comes in, they are required to exchange their freshwater ballast that they may have gotten when they were in a foreign country and take on saltwater ballast, because usually what happens if you put a freshwater organism into saltwater, it usually dies. And so what we do is, as it comes through the Seaway, we do an inspection on every single one of those ballast tanks and make sure that there is that they have done that exchange. And we have had 100% compliance, and I'm looking for my totals here. So we have done 8,361 ballast tanks were assessed during the 455 transits coming into the Seaway and into the Great Lakes, and we have had 100% compliance. Occasionally, somebody comes in and they have not exchanged their ballast water. Well, then what do? Well, we tell them two things. Either you go back out and you exchange your ballast water. That's a heck of a run if you're already in Montreal to go all the way back. Or we lock down their tanks, and they are prohibited from exchanging any ballast water while they're in the system. And a lot of those vessels are able to do that. They don't need that ballast water exchanged like some of the Lakers do. And so we lock that in. And we write them a letter and say that you can't exchange your ballast water. We trust but verify. Because when they come back out, after perhaps picking up grain from Duluth, and they come back out, we then go back and we make sure that the salinity and the volume of the ballast water that they had coming in is the same salinity and volume of ballast water that they have on the way back out. And so through that regime, we have had no new invasive species coming into the Great Lakes. Another really great success. So as I stated, the Coast Guard's ability to conduct these distinct, but as you can see, very interrelated responsibilities and missions is really our core focus and our core strength, and it's what we bring to the nation. The programs and standards that I've described are meant to be the first and foremost and to prevent an accident. Preventing is always what we strive for. And if an incident does occur, as I talked about, we first prepare and exercise, and then, of course, we remain always ready to respond when we need to. The state of the Great Lakes are strong and vibrant. They're a strong environment because of our working relationship with the maritime industry and the professionals who make their living on the waters for decades. They are strong and vibrant because of our working relationships with the larger marine community, nonprofit organizations, yacht clubs, boaters, that dedicate their lives to the safety and stewardship of the water. They are strong because of our working relationship with the Canadian counterparts, whether that be the law enforcement, Transport Canada, search and rescue, or oil spills. They are strong because of our partnerships with the federal, state, tribal, and local organizations, and even our fire and police agencies that help us with search and rescue. The Great Lakes are strong because of the selfless, dedicated, patriotic servants who serve this nation in the Coast Guard in a life jacket, sometimes in greasy coveralls, and sometimes in a suit in the federal building. They, of course, serve not for the money, and certainly not for the glory, but they serve each of you. And I have giants like Captain John Little that I talked about that are part of that 6,000 folks. His predecessors, the commanding officers and officers in charges of the stations and shore units that answer the call to save a life or to work a buoy. If you haven't seen like dirtiest jobs working a buoy, that's like something you might want to YouTube, because that is a really tough job with lots of bird, shall we say, excrement. That is a tough job, but they love doing it, and they take great pride in pulling a dirty buoy on deck and putting a clean one back. And it's great because of the working crews that conduct the ice-breaking missions and the law enforcement missions, and those unsung heroes like Emily, who sit in a little, 20 by 20 room with no windows for 12 hours and do nothing but wait for the radio to sound off, that we can then start launching our assets and making them go. We also are very proud of our volunteers, our Coast Guard auxiliaries. I've had the great honor to recognize some of them with a 30-year certificate. They've been volunteering in that organization for 30 years, and some of them 40. And recently I had, this past year, 3 of them, 50 years. One of them was a World War II veteran, has been serving as a volunteer. So they definitely don't do it for the money at all. But these are your guardians, and they keep the Great Lakes great. But together, we have to ensure that we have the safety, security, and stewardship of our national treasure. And that, for me, is the state of your Great Lakes. Thank you.
Today, we are enjoying a Friday forum featuring Rear Admiral June E. Ryan, Commander of U.S. Coast Guard's 9th District. We're about to head into the Q&A, and we welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via radio, broadcast, webcast, or our new live simulcast at the Parma Snow Branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and the staff will try to work it into the program. Holding the microphones today are Director of Programming Stephanie Jansky and Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg. May we have the first question, please?
Admiral, thank you so much for, sorry.
Hey.
Admiral, thank you so much for joining us today. There's a popular narrative in the media here in Northeast Ohio that one federal agency in the area is not doing everything it can to protect our Great Lakes. If you would believe the press, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is actively trying to poison us by dumping Cuyahoga River dredging material into the open lake. They are trying to do everything they can to get Asian carp up the Illinois River into the Chicago River and into the Great Lakes. And they routinely don't seek enough money in their budget to fully dredge the Cuyahoga. Perhaps you can shed some perspective as to why we have the narrative wrong. Could you shed some background information or some insight as to what the Army Corps of Engineers really is trying to do for our lakes? Thank you.
Well, I can tell you that the Army Corps of Engineers really, as we talked about before, whether it's with Asian carp or other things, are really our partners. And I can tell you they are like every other federal agency who their leaderships fight for every dollar that they can get. It's not like the Army Corps is walking up to Congress, to a former congresswoman, right? And saying, why don't you give back that $10 million? We really don't need that. They are up there fighting for absolutely every single dime. I, very, very much like my workforce, I've had the opportunity to work with their leadership, with the generals, on both the Mississippi rivers and in the Great Lakes region, and I can tell you that they are hardened patriots who are dedicated to the Great Lakes and to making the infrastructure, not only here in the Great Lakes, but around the world, the best that it can be. One of the things, as you know, they're also working on is the Sioux locks, and they're working to revise some of their earlier calculations, and I think hopefully, where's Jim Weekly? I hope in my lifetime that we would see potentially a new Sioux lock. But I can tell you they are not up there not asking for money, and they are not up there to poison. They are just as dedicated. They live in the Great Lakes just like we live in the Great Lakes. It's completely incongruent to think that they would poison the same drinking water that they are drinking from. That would be my perspective.
Yes, as a kind of a follow-up question, can you explain the difference in jurisdiction of the Corps of Engineers and the Coast Guard over navigable waters?
Well, some of that is very overlapping. What I would say is we work hand in hand. Specifically, it's probably the easiest to describe whenever a hurricane comes through. So what we do, one of the first things we have to do if we have a hurricane or a big storm event or a flood, the first thing we have to do is get commerce moving again. Some of the best way to get the most amount of rescue equipment and first aid is via the water system. Well, we can't do that. The Army Corps does that. So they go through and make sure, are there any anomalies? Are there any bumps that have come, and they try to dredge those out. Once they've dredged those out, we have our buoy tenders that go back and start marking the channel. So it's kind of like above the water, below the water as it relates to those waterways.
Somewhat in the same vein, I am a boater, and I see the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, people on the water, City of Cleveland Police Department on the water. And would you sort of explain what the multiple jurisdictions are and how they work? And also the Coast Guard Auxiliary, what do they do?
Absolutely. So I'll start with the latter. The Coast Guard Auxiliary is really our boating safety arm. And as I talked about, we have the Coast Guard Auxiliary here puts on, first and foremost, what they do is a lot of boating safety classes. That's where most people recognize and interface with the Coast Guard Auxiliary. A lot of folks will take the Coast Guard Auxiliary classes because it lowers their insurance rates on their boats. But they also do many, many other things. They do public outreach. They do what they call courtesy vessel marine exams. So they will come aboard. So if they're at a boat launch, for example, they will come aboard and make sure and check that you have your, you've probably been one. They've checked the life-saving equipment. Do you have enough life jackets? Do you have enough flares, whistles, those kind of things? And then they'll let you know, if you got caught, if you got stopped by the Coast Guard or you got stopped by another law enforcement agency, they would probably see that you are decrement in these areas. And so that's really, so they are really the volunteer piece to our Coast Guard. On the active duty side, we, of course, if we stop a boater and we have, for example, a hazardous situation, say boating while intoxicated, right? Not that we ever have folks who drink and drive, but say we did. Maybe on Kelly's Island or someplace. What we would then do is we have the law enforcement authority to take that boater off the water. And then what we do is partner, because they're not going to come back to the Coast Guard station. We do not have a place to process them. And then we partner usually with the local county or local sheriff that then will take that boater who has done whatever that violation might have been. The other agencies have their own jurisdiction, so the state agencies, just like you would see a state patrolman might be coming down your neighborhood just as much as your local city police department, and they have those jurisdictions, and some of them overlap. So that's really the relationship between those agencies. It is pretty complex. The law enforcement piece on the Great Lakes and the overlaps, and then you throw in the international piece, it's a pretty complex matrices.
Admiral Ryan, thanks for your kind words today.
Absolutely.
Quick comment and then a question. So my name's Chris Winslow. I'm interim director for the Ohio Sea Grant Program, so a NOAA federally funded program, but also Ohio State University's Stone Lab. And both of the missions of those programs are research, education, and outreach. And I want to ask kind of a question along the research line. Is there anything that we can be doing? Actually, first I should do the comment before I take in the.
Yeah.
we get our vessels inspected that we have in our fleet by the Coast Guard all the time, and it's a fantastic group to work with, and thank you for your support.
Great.
But for the question, coming to the research side of things, is there anything that we can do in the future with the research entities we work with, the academic institutions around the state, to couple with the Coast Guard to get sampling that occurs on those vessels? You have tremendous spread across the lake, not only Erie, but all the Great Lakes. Putting monitor equipment or using the buoy infrastructure to do sampling that's important for maintaining the health of the lakes.
Well, I can be happy to talk to you offline about those things, but we certainly partner, whether it's via project or sometimes with agencies. So we put out, for example, the NOAA buoys, and a lot of times those NOAA buoys have some of those sensors on board, and we are the ones that actually maintain. We pull those buoys when we need to, whenever the ice is coming out. But occasionally we do partner with other agencies if there's a need for somebody to go out. And we have the vessel that's available if they're out already on training and it's not costing anything other than that opportunity. We would probably do that. I know we've done it in the past. Mm-hmm.
Admiral, a number of years ago, the states and provinces bordering the Great Lakes entered into the Great Lakes Compact, supposedly to prevent diversion of Great Lakes waters outside of the Great Lakes watershed. We all know that there are certain states in the southwest of this country that would be delighted to be at the receiving end of a pipeline from the Great Lakes. We see the city of Waukesha in Wisconsin, which is outside of the Great Lakes watershed, having made application, and for some inexplicable reason, none of the governors of any of the states have opposed that request, which any of them could and veto it immediately. So my question is, number one, does the Coast Guard have any role in arriving at the recommendation as to what to do with the Waukesha application? And if they do, where are we?
Okay, I am not aware of any role that we have on the Waukesha. I will say to the broader Great Lakes Compact, we do have now the Great Lakes and Premier's Governors Council that meets periodically. They have signed some water sharing agreements that are pretty restrictive, and I'd be guessing if I quoted it exactly, but we're very active in some of that divergence. We have looked at some of the other issues as it relates to water levels, and there's been some dialogue and some discussion between some of the environmentalists and other users. As I talked about, this is a great treasure, but we also have very diverse users. And so for one use, they want the water levels very low. For other users, for the Lakers, they would want the water levels very high. And so we are absolutely in those discussions and those dialogues as it relates both in a instant, say they need to raise the water levels for a certain reason over 2 or 3 weeks, or if it looks like it's more of a long-term, we're going to enter into this agreement, we are 100% at the table anytime those dialogues are going on. But I don't know of anything that we're doing on the Waukesha piece.
Rear Admiral, I am happy to say that your success and your confidence in your presentation today make me shy about asking this question.
Okay.
But I'm going to do it anyway.
That's good.
Do you still encounter, and I guess the implication is that somewhere along the line you must have encountered, but do you still encounter any limit imposed upon you on what you can accomplish in your professional role because you are a woman?
Interesting. I will say in my current position, no, because I'm the Admiral. In fact, I would say quite opposite sometimes happens. I'll say, that would look, I wonder what that would look like if it was painted just a light blue so it and tomorrow there'll be somebody in here painting that darn, I'm like, I just said what I was just thinking out loud. So sometimes the opposite happens when you're the Admiral. Have I had some challenges? Absolutely. I think any working woman in this audience could probably give 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 examples of where they've encountered some difficult individuals. But you know what? That's what you kind of power through. What I always try to do is throughout my career, and I'm teaching this to my 14-year-old daughter, no matter where you go and no matter what you do, you are going to have jerks. And so I recommend that she really work on how to deal with her jerks. Elevate your skills and how you can transcend those kind of folks. And so I think I have done that fairly successfully. I've been very fortunate to actually have the opportunity when somebody has challenged me to either prove them wrong via my professionalism, prove them wrong via my skills, or prove them wrong with my wit. And so that's probably the tools that I've used throughout my career. It's interesting that you asked that. We talked about many historical firsts just recently, obviously with former Secretary Clinton being the first nominee of a major party. I had the opportunity, she had mentioned that I was the military aide to the president. That happened to be under the Clinton administration, the last year of his first administration and first year of his second administration. And so it's kind of interesting, but as I look around, there's a lot of historical firsts. Betty, are you the first woman of the Seaway?
No, not the first of that.
Oh, so she has many firsts in her past, and I've had many firsts in mine, and I consider it a great honor and a privilege to have that. I will be leaving this weekend, actually, going to the Joint Women's Leadership Symposium in Washington, D.C., where there will be 700 military ladies at a symposium to talk about women in the military. And there are 3 different countries who are coming as well, to include Australia and South Korea, who are going to be there, who want to learn from us. Because some of those countries are still very restrictive in what they can do. They can only be clerics. They can only be journalists. And we are not that. I can be a ship captain. I can, jump out of helicopters. We have no restrictions whatsoever. And so they're here to learn about what we do. So occasionally it's always good to go back and re-baseline and say, wow, we got it pretty good. And so that's been great. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you for coming. I worked for the City of Cleveland for 35 years in the engineering department. And I have 2 questions. First is a yes or no. The second I'd like you to elaborate on. And our department was responsible for the lift bridges over the river. And every once in a while, one of them would fail. And I know we would get calls from the Army Corps of Engineers to clear the channel. Was the Coast Guard involved in those type of issues? And number two deals with the national security event happening, and I believe half of the port security units are in Cleveland. And what about you being called overseas to any place where the Navy or the military would need, quote unquote, your port protection? Thank you.
Sure. So yes, we have a bridge division, and our responsibility is to make sure that maritime commerce is able to traverse the river. Ships, particularly when they are in a small navigable water like the Cuyahoga, the Crooked River, it's very hard for them to just pull over to the side. And so there is a priority, there is a national priority that the bridges be lifted. And so that's why there's a requirement that if for some reason there's a mechanical reason why a bridge can't be lifted, that they notify us immediately so we can then notify the ships that are coming in so that they don't get into some perilous condition. So yes, we do that. We do have a Port Security Unit 309. There's several of them around the country. There's 313, which is up in Washington State. There's 311, which is in California. These are our port security units that deploy worldwide. And I will say my aide, Lloyd Heflin, has actually deployed twice over to the Persian Gulf and once to Gitmo, to Guantanamo Bay, where we have the detention facility. And he has served in both of those capacities as a Coast Guard person. Many people don't know that. The Port Security Unit in Port Clinton is getting ready and doing their workups for deployments to once again deploy down to Guantanamo Bay to do that very important mission. They've recently returned from Korea, where they did the Combined Joint Over-the-Shore Logistics exercise, JLOTS, and one of the folks who did that's right here from PSU 309, because of his efforts and the amount and volume that they were able to do this logistics lift all the way to Korea and all the way back, was awarded the Coast Guard Enlisted Person of the Year. What's unique about that is of all of the 40,000 people, 6,000 reservists, he was the Enlisted Person of the Year. Last year's Enlisted Person of the Year also came from Port Security 309. So we have a powerhouse of a port security unit that deploys worldwide, that deploys for exercises worldwide, that deploys for operations worldwide. Vast majority of them are your community because they are reservists. They are your fellow workers, they are your policemen, they are your firemen, and they deploy for 6 months or a year and then come back to your employment. So for all of the employers who are here, whether it be the Coast Guard Reserve or any other armed service, I would say thank you very much for your support of those people when they go to serve their country, and then the welcome home when they come back.
Admiral, it's so great to have you here for this State of the Great Lakes presentation. So thank you first and foremost for that and for your service. Your career has spanned several decades, and
Thanks.
There's a point to that. In 2001, the Coast Guard was sort of organized under the Department of Homeland Security, and prior to that, it was under the Department of Transportation, if I'm not mistaken.
And then prior to that, under the Treasury.
So how's it going?
Very good.
The question is really, is that the right place for it now 15 years later? And is it working, or is there a better way? You've seen two sides at any rate.
Right. Well, that's a really great question, and one that I would say that I have a little bit of perspective on. I had the opportunity to work for the Department of Homeland Security. That was my first assignment when I was promoted to Admiral. I had the privilege of being the military advisor to Secretary Johnson. What I told folks there that I did, I was basically the plumber. So I put the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense together. So when we needed a large DoD asset to help us do our mission, we plugged the two of those things together. Secretary Johnson, I cannot tell you, is more supportive than probably any secretary we've had. Admiral Thad Allen, when we first transitioned over, he said, "We're finally home." To give you some idea, which I thought was very telling. Why do I say that? I had the opportunity to work at the department, and what I see now is Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Coast Guard, TSA, Secret Service. Secret Service now doesn't have to go to another department, because how chain of command in the federal government works, right? You go up through your secretary, across to their secretary, back down to their secretary, right? We don't have to do that anymore. And so they were under Treasury, of course. We were under Transportation. So every time they needed a small boat asset, if the president, for example, was staying at a hotel that's on the water, they need a little boat that's out there, right? Well, they'd have to go up and over and back down. And so now we don't have to do that anymore. It's very great. And I will say one more thing about Secretary Johnson. I'll put a little plug in for him. So how much does he support the Coast Guard? He has really supported our recapitalization of our boats, ships, and aircraft. He has said, if I were ever to advise somebody of an agency to join, I would have them join the Coast Guard. And you know what? He puts his money where his mouth is. His son is in the Coast Guard.
Today at the City Club, we've been enjoying the Friday Forum with Rear Admiral June E. Ryan, Commander of the U.S. Coast Guard's 9th District. Today's forum is the Hope and Stanley Adelstein Forum on the Environment, made possible by a gift from Mr. and Mrs. Adelstein. They were great friends of the City Club. We miss them and appreciate their support. Today's forum is also the annual State of the Great Lakes Forum, sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. Rear Admiral Ryan also appears as part of the City Club Local Heroes series, sponsored by Dominion. The community partner of the City Club is the Cleveland Water Alliance, and they are thanked for their support and partnership. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association, the Great Lakes Towing Company, and Great Lakes Shipyard, and the U.S. Coast Guard 9th District. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Rear Admiral June Ryan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.